This is One Universe at a Time. I'm Brian Koberlein. You've seen the photos online of the giant swirling garbage patch in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The reality is not quite so dramatic, but still a serious issue to scientists and others concerned with the health of the Earth. Today we're going to hear from Dr. Matthew Hoffman, an assistant professor of mathematics at the Rochester Institute of Technology, about how scientists are measuring and modeling the pollution floating in our oceans and Great Lakes. So I've been reading about this massive pile of trash out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Because of the ocean currents, all the plastic and everything gets kind of swept into this one area.
So yes and no, right? So the general oceanographic perspective is right that there are these gyres in the ocean, that the dominant currents are these circular patterns. The western boundary currents are these swift moving, like the Gulf Stream, right? That come northward from the equator in the northern hemisphere, and their primary role is bringing heat from the tropics up to the north, and then it continues sort of in a circle, and it comes across.
The cold comes down.
Towards England in the Atlantic, and then there's a similar thing in the Pacific. There's something called the Kuroshio Current, which is the equivalent to the Gulf Stream off the coast of Japan. And so these travel in a circle, and there is this called the Ekman Current, which actually is sort of a result of Coriolis that tends to point in the northern hemisphere to the right of motion. And so there is this current that then moves things into the middle.
Kind of like the eye of a storm.
Yes. And in fact, sort of the opposite of what you think about if you were swirling a glass. Because if you're swirling a glass, then the force is out, but here it's sort of in.
Right.
So there is this tendency to have them coalesce. And there is definitely a lot of plastic and other things that get dumped into the oceans. And as a result, there do tend to be higher concentrations in specific locations that correspond to these areas where the currents are pushing them.
And when you say higher concentrations, I mean, is this something that if you try and sail to it, you're going to see this massive pile of trash?
So this is one of the biggest misconceptions when you hear about these things, is that it's larger than Texas.
Yeah, I think larger than Texas.
Choose your favorite comparison of a large thing.
Or something.
Yeah, and a lot of times you'll even see, on the internet or things, these images of these real massive garbage piles in water that aren't actually the garbage patch in the Pacific. These tend to be pictures from rivers or bays or inland things that people have
you see some of these pictures where the rivers just clog up.
And then that's not what happens in the Pacific Ocean at all. You could take a boat and go through it and not actually see anything.
So you wouldn't even notice. Unless
it's
you
quite
actually
possible you wouldn't notice. I mean, you might, right? There's a lot of large garbage in the oceans, and especially with things like the tsunamis that happened in Asia wash some of these massive things, or people just throw them away sometimes. So there are these refrigerators floating that you might run into in the middle of the ocean, but that's not predominantly what people are talking about there. It's actually more of a you'll hear the term thrown around. People talking about it as more of a soup, and a lot of these things have sort of been traveling for a bit. They're in the salt water, they're in the sun if they're near there, and they tend to break down a little bit. And so you have a lot of little broken down pieces of garbage and plastic that form and are not maybe on the surface, but maybe just below the surface, maybe get mixed up a little bit in this mixed layer, which is
so how big are the typical
ocean.
Pieces? I mean, we're talking about like sugar cube sized, or is it
so
more
actually
sand
even
sized?
smaller? I mean, they measure a whole bunch of them. Part of the problem is that you can't totally see them past a certain size, but there's a range of sizes. And so people are talking from, millimeter or lower. People do study this by taking nets out there, very, very fine nets, and then doing studies where they collect all these bits and the particles and they run them through sieves to filter out the sizes. There's a bunch of different categories, and I wish I could remember exactly what the size breakup is, but there's macroplastic and microplastic and microscopic plastic.
Right. When asteroids, for example, they come in a range of sizes, but they are more numerous the smaller you go. So you get a few big ones, and then, if you had one big one, you'd have 10 medium size and 100 tiny ones and 1,000 microscopic ones.
Yes.
So it would seem like that would be the same type of thing, where the smaller you go, the more you've got.
I believe has been the case with a lot of them, although I don't remember exactly what the distribution that people have found out in the Pacific tends to be. But depending on how you study them, you'll see different things. I mean, there's been these people taking cruises, scientific cruises.
Right.
And doing nets to try to catch these, and then doing counts where they actually have to sit there and count by hand.
Right.
All
this is what
pieces.
you have graduate students for.
This is what graduate students are for, exactly. Undergrads even. Right?
Undergrads even. Go ahead and count that stuff. We're doing science.
Yeah, no, exactly. Or even you'll see studies where there are counts from the stomachs of animals. So this is the kind of thing that you hear a lot about, is because you do get some of these very small plastic beads that will end up in fish or birds or these sorts of things will travel through the food chain. So there have been counts in the stomachs, and then
is that the most problematic thing? I mean, it doesn't sink,
right?
So it's not just going to the bottom of the ocean.
Some of it does actually. Yeah. I mean, a lot of these things you tend to think of them as neutral density, but it might be that that's just what we see because
that's
it's
what
there.
We see. Yeah, the rest of the
there
stuff
have been estimates that maybe as much as 70% of them actually end up at the bottom at some point and actually aren't floating on the surface. So it is sort of unclear in terms of the vertical distribution. That's something that's not very clear right now at all.
And it's the food chain that becomes a problem.
The food chain is one of the things that people are worried about. You know, that you definitely can find examples of them in various wildlife, and you know, so they get eaten. When they break down, they can release some toxic substances. Some of the chemicals.
Even when they eat plastic, and that's what they're doing.
Yes, and so that can be a problem, and it can travel up a little bit, like if a smaller animal eats them, and they end up in sort
small
of a bigger
fish
animal.
Eat the plastic, the big fish eat the small fish, and then you've got plastic in the big fish.
Yeah, I don't think there's been a lot of people with plastic and from eating these, but it's definitely maybe the next level down or so that people have seen that. So that's a concern. There's still some research being done that I know of. The people are looking into the different types of organisms that grow on these plastics, because they do get biofoul. There are bacteria and things that then grow on these plastics.
All of a sudden, now there's plastic there, so then they evolve the adaptability.
And so exactly
to use
what happens with that, I think, is still something that a lot of people are researching, and is an interesting category. But you know, the sort of effect is an interesting question, and it's one of those that there's definitely I think an initial visceral reaction to, oh God, there's this massive,
this thing the size of Texas is out in the Pacific. That can't be good.
Yeah, and the other stat that's great is there was a paper in Science that just came out this past month where they tried to estimate the input of plastic into the oceans, looking at economic factors, looking at all the different nations, what their, how much their industrial waste they're producing,
how much is accounted
for,
what
the population centers are, what their treatment and what their measures are in terms of making sure that they don't release this. Also, where the population centers are near the water or not. And try to account
we like living by the water.
We do,
as people.
It used to make shipping really nice, and it's pretty.
It's pretty.
Before all the garbage came in,
trash.
But anyway, so they did this estimate, and they had a great way of distilling this that I've heard on a number of places where they said basically the amount of garbage that they came up with it amounts to, I think, 5 plastic garbage bags full of plastic per foot of coastline.
Oh, man.
Was their estimate, and so it's a nice example of fun science, but also a fun way to describe what they were doing, because it's definitely an image. It's definitely an image that sits in per year, I believe.
Per year,
I think it was. I believe. So there's a lot that goes in there, and there's definitely a sort of, as I said, there's this reaction to that. That's got to be bad.
I mean,
that can't be good.
It can't be good. I mean, does it go away? I mean, does it?
Right. So some of it degrades slowly, and some of it eventually might sink. I said maybe as much as 70%. But there's this question of exactly what effects it has, and I guess sort of where it ranges on the list of things that we need to deal with regards to our effect on the environment. That would be a potentially debatable one. But I mean, one thing about the garbage patches is that they tend to be in regions of the ocean where there weren't as vibrant ecosystems to begin with. Not that there wasn't life there, but just because of...
So the weaker ecosystem gets more polluted than
a
strong ecosystem?
Well, it's not as weaker. It was just there tends to be less biological activity in those regions of the ocean because of...
So it's just biomass in that sense. The more...
Yes, I mean, there's
living
less,
things you have there.
Yeah, so there was less living things there to begin with, for the most part. These tend to be sort of ocean deserts.
Okay, it's kind of weird. You think ocean desert. Yeah. It's like what? There's plenty of water here, but
there is plenty of water. I've heard people say, and not the people who you would normally think about saying this, but scientists saying sort of this if all of this garbage that we're doing ends up in the middle of the Pacific.
Right.
In some ways,
as long as it's not in my backyard.
Yeah, well, there are certainly worse places that it could be.
But it does raise an interesting point, because we think of pollution as bad.
Yeah.
And I know in physics we have that same type of thing where it's radiation is bad. Yes and no, because radiation is bad, but bananas have radiation because they have potassium in it, and the amount of that you get is not a big deal.
Yeah.
So it seems almost like heresy to ask the same question about pollution. Is it how much pollution? I mean, it's obviously not great, but how much pollution is that big of a deal?
Yeah, it's definitely not ideal and it is sort of a big deal in some sense. But then there's the question of exactly what the impact is and what it would take to clean it up, which is a whole other issue.
Is the cure worse than the problem? And
or it doesn't need to be cleaned up right now versus do we just need to do a better job of making sure stuff doesn't get in there into the future. There's that sort of thing, right? I mean, it's not quite like some of these oil spills where it's like, but this needs to be cleaned up.
Right. There isn't a lot of benefit to the oil spill, and it's immediate and by the coast.
And by the coast, right.
That's the other part.
And so this is the
coastal pollution that's a problem more.
Now, the other thing about the so-called garbage patches is that it's not just one. There's a few places where you get sort of convergence of currents, and there tends to be more there, right? But it's not sort of this cohesive unit that sits there in the middle of the Pacific, and that's helpful too, because actually, you start thinking about, hey, there's probably a lot of garbage in these other bodies of water too. So you've seen in the past 5 years or something a lot more interested in what's going on in the Great Lakes. Is there all of
the largest source of fresh water in the world?
Yep. And for us, it's right here.
It's right by the coast.
So there's a lot of interest in this sort of as well, trying to figure out what the impact is.
In the Great Lakes, are there any big patches?
I guess it's unclear yet whether they're big patches. Again, it's hard to observe, and a lot of the data that people get in the Great Lakes, there was just a study that came out in the Journal of Great Lakes Research about observations of plastics and a number of the studies that have been done. And a lot of the results, just people from beach cleanups, right, recording what they're seeing, what the debris is, and
because we do that. I mean, there's that on the regular basis.
There's a lot of
getting this kind of
nonprofit
back.
and so a lot of it ends up on shore, especially this close, and they are getting cleaned up. Now there's some issues about whether there's bias because the cleanups tend to happen in popular beaches. So how much
well-to-do neighborhoods get a lot more cleansing than the poor neighborhoods.
If there's a public beach, it's probably going to be cleaned up more than the uninhabited shoreline. And so the question is, because there's more people there, are that counts reliable? But the other thing that's interesting, both in the Pacific and the Great Lakes so far, is there's definitely plastic there. But some of the counts you hear are, you hear people talk about a high concentration. Well, actually, a very high concentration of plastics would be, say, and they normally talk about counts, right? So they're talking about, whether it's a microplastic or a microscopic number of units of plastic, right? But you see numbers that are less than 1 unit per meter square. Okay. And this is a high
one
concentration.
Bit of plastic,
right? One
the size of a grain of sand or something would be per cubic meter,
per square meter of area. Would be a fairly high plastic distribution, and probably if you tried to filter down more and more, maybe it would go up a little bit. But I mean, you're still, this is a little bit far from this picture of, this giant garbage patch that you can walk on, right?
On the order
not quite
of
floating
grams per square meter or something.
Yeah, something like that, and which is sort of a high concentration. Again, it's something I'm interested in. It's something I think is worrying. But it's one of those things that you hear a lot about. It's something I end up talking to people a lot about because it gets sort of blown up. But so it is a problem. It's just good to have an idea of what the actual issue is and where it fits in and how to frame it properly.
You're listening to One Universe at a Time. I'm your host, Brian Koberlein. We've been talking with Dr. Matthew Hoffman, Assistant Professor of Mathematics at the Rochester Institute of Technology, about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. In the second half of our show, Dr. Hoffman gets to ask the questions, and I get to answer. Today, he'd like to know about how astronomers have learned to establish the age and size of our universe.
Stars. We say we know a lot about them. They've got this life cycle, right?
Yep. They last for billions of years, explode in supernovas, all that type of thing.
And so how do we know that, right? We don't have a lab experiment of a
star. We're only looking at them for a couple of decades,
right? And
versus the billions of years.
Brief times, we can only see them.
Right. The thing is that even though we can't watch an individual star for billions of years, we can look at lots and lots of stars all at the same time. A good analogy would be, suppose there were aliens from a different star that could take an image of the Earth, but only for 1 second. So they could take this very detailed image, so detailed that they could see individual people, but they can only see it for 1 second. And if you did that, then you would see some people that were old, you would see some people that were young, you would see children, you would see adults, you would see people working, you would see people sleeping. And by looking at this whole range of people, you can start putting the pieces together and go, well, we know that sometimes they sleep, we know that sometimes they're awake. If you did the statistics for how many people were asleep at any given time, you could say this is about how long they sleep.
You see, there's a lot of stars out there, right? So can you take pictures of similar things that you think are similar and do statistics on that too? Or is it really just looking at one star?
Well, you're looking at a whole bunch of different stars. In fact, one of the early cases in which we could start understanding stellar evolution was something called the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram. And basically what it is you look at a whole range of stars, as many stars as you can see, and you measure how bright they actually are and what color they are, which is a measure of what temperature they are, because hotter stars are more blue than cooler stars, which are more red. So if you plot a whole bunch of stars on a graph, this Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, you get kind of horizontal is color, vertical is brightness. And what you see is most of the stars actually lie along a kind of diagonal line, kind of this diagonal curve, in which the hotter they are, the brighter they are. And the vast majority of stars are there. Then you see some that are really cool but really bright. And then you see some that are really bright but or not very bright, but very hot.
How did we decide that those were the two important things to plot? I've always kind of wondered about that diagram, right? It's like, are there a lot of these things that are in the trash can with different...
Well, it actually kind of comes out the fact that those are two things that are fairly easy to measure.
Okay.
So historically, we can do brightness because we can see how bright a star appears just in the sky. That's called apparent magnitude. And then we can, if we know the distance, we can calculate what its absolute magnitude is, what its actual brightness is.
Now, how do I know how far away it is?
Well, you can tell how far away it is in different ways. One of the common ways is parallax. So if you look at a star compared to very distant stars, parallax is something that you would see how we get depth perception.
Right.
So the classic thing of hold your thumb up, look at it with one eye, switch eyes, and the thumb appears to shift relative against, the distant trees.
And 3D stuff works. Because
and 3D
you put red and blue images with...
Right, or polarized images in the case of modern movies. And so by measuring that parallax, the bigger the parallax, the closer the star. There are other ways that we can do things.
And actually, even though they're that far away, we can still resolve that difference on Earth?
Yeah, we can actually measure the angle to a few fractions of a second of arc. So we can do, I think the latest ones are about 1,500 light years.
Yeah, I find that amazing.
That. It's an amazing precision when you really come down to it. But that only gets us to a certain distance. And then there's other methods that we can do. There are variable stars called Cepheid variables that we know from parallax have a certain brightness based upon how they vary in brightness.
The thing about the Cepheid variables is I kind of have to go back to the first question, which is how do we know that that's how they behave in the first place?
Right. Well, in the case of Cepheid variables, we know that we can measure what their absolute brightness is because we've measured their parallax. And so Henrietta Swan Leavitt measured the absolute brightness of them on average with the period at which they oscillate, how fast they oscillate or how slowly they oscillate, and found this relationship in that the brighter they actually are, the faster they oscillate. And so we can actually use that to go to the distance of galaxies. And then we can look at things like supernovas in galaxies. There's a type of supernova called type 1a supernovae that tend to explode at the same brightness all the time. And so they're used as standard candles, and we can go billions of light years out. So we can actually do this.
It's kind of amazing. So basically, a lot of the early research was trying to figure out what these sort of standards are.
Right. Finding those standards. How do we determine the scale of
these sort of waypoints?
And that's one of the things that we think of astronomy as being this very ancient tradition. It's like one of the earliest sciences. And yet, in terms of the scale of the universe, we actually didn't know anything beyond our galaxy. We didn't know if anything was actually beyond our galaxy until the 1900s. So I think in the 1920s or 1930s, there was a great debate about whether the Milky Way was everything in the universe or whether the Andromeda Nebula, which we now call the Andromeda Galaxy.
So these are obviously people had seen.
Right, we can see the Andromeda Nebula. What they used to call the Andromeda Nebula, we now call it the Andromeda Galaxy. But you can see it, but how far away is it?
For that debate, what ended up being, one of the, I don't know, was there a smoking gun? Was there something that ended that debate?
It's kind of interesting because the debate was, if you take, for example, the Andromeda Galaxy, is it actually a close nebula in the range of the Milky Way?
Right.
Or is it millions of light years away? Is it a separate island universe, far away? And the kind of more prominent scientists would say that it was actually close. And there was a guy who was arguing that it was actually a million light years away or more.
Okay.
And his argument was, if you look in the Andromeda Galaxy, you find what they called nova. What we now know are supernova. Mm-hmm. But you would see these nova exploding in the Andromeda Galaxy, and if you counted them up, they were vastly more than what we would see in our own galaxy.
Okay.
So if you're getting all those nova in one spot, that clearly has to be an entire galaxy. It clearly has to be the size of the Milky Way, so it has to be far away. Now, the counter-argument to that was, well, wait, if they're millions of years away and they're actually exploding, they would have to be far brighter than any nova we have ever seen. Well, it turns out they are. And so that's how we know. It actually was the Cepheid variables that allowed us to determine that distance.
So eventually people were able to really observe the Cepheid variables.
Right. So Henrietta Leavitt got the relationship for Cepheid variables, and then Edwin Hubble and a few others could actually measure that distance and said, no, they really are millions of light years away.
It's just a crazy sort of conceptual shift trying to imagine.
It is.
Wrapping your head around that.
Less than 100 years ago, our galaxy was all there was to the universe.
Yeah.
And in just a single century, we've gone from that to not only is the universe billions of light years across.
And still growing.
But it's billions of years old, and it's expanding, and it has, billions of galaxies out there. We've radically changed. In many ways, this past century in cosmology has changed as radically as going from an Earth-centered universe to a sun-centered universe.
Yeah, so it's interesting when you're looking at all these stars, right? You're getting them at different points, even if they're similar types of stars, right? Slightly different points in their lifetimes.
Right. We can tell how bright they are by measuring their distance. So we know their magnitudes, and that's fairly straightforward to do. And getting their colors we can do, particularly now with photographic images, we can do what their colors are. And we now know, at the time when they were first doing it, they didn't know that color was related to temperature.
Right.
But we now do know that color is related to temperature for most stars. There's, some weird ones. But we find this general trend that we now know is what we call the main sequence. And statistically, since most of the stars are there, stars on average must spend most of their lives there. If we know that we find a third of humans happen to be at a house, we know that a third of their time is spent at home. Well, if we spent most of the time of the stars is in that main sequence, we know that most of them are there.
It's funny, though. Going back to your original analogy about aliens looking at Earth, right? It seems, okay, you see these really small, what we would know are babies, right? You see, younger people, you see these old people, but... and so certainly we have an understanding of what the life cycle is, so it makes sense that would be a logical conclusion. But in some sense, wouldn't it seem just as logical to say, well, some people clearly are born gray, and some people are born sort of tiny. These are different. Well, to give an idea, they're not evolving into one another, right? That these are just completely different beings, right?
We are also relying on physics, so we're not just looking at the statistics.
Because you'd also see
the physics of it,
all sorts of other animals, and you wouldn't necessarily say, well, clearly the dog is part of the life cycle.
Well, to give you an example, if these aliens actually were, they're living things similar to us, then they would know that organisms can grow or decrease in size. They know that if they have the same physical makeup, that they are not changing one. They are related genetically, for example. But you could take a simple example. If you looked at the height of humans based upon the statistics, and if you did the statistics of heights, what you would find is you have little humans, babies, children, and then you find that the vast majority of them are actually of an average adult height. So given that, a human can last 70 or 80 years, 70% of them are adult-sized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you find some that are really tiny and a very few that are in between, statistically.
Yeah.
And so from that, you could say, well, they start off small, and they enter a period of rapid growth until they become an adult size, and that's the size for the rest of their lives. And statistically, we can do that.
Okay. And so you said also there's sort of the physics that we think we know about the universe, too.
Right.
And gradually, right, telescopes, well, you were able to look at the spectral characteristics,
right? We can look at,
and that way you can actually get,
before.
You can get more than just brightness and color, but you can actually get the chemical components in a lot of senses, which lends credence to some of the physics that you think is
There's
happening.
A correlation between the physics and the observation. So if we look at our sun, for example, we know that fusion occurs in its core. We know we can see neutrinos coming off of it. We can calculate by particle physics what the energy released is for that. And so if you look at the neutrino rates, if you look at the size of the sun, what the inner temperature would be, you can calculate out how long the sun would burn. And you get something on the order of 10 billion years. And you get that the sun is about 5 billion years old right now. If you look at other similar massed stars, you find that, in fact, the statistics give you about 10 billion years. Yeah. You find larger stars last less time. And cooler stars, red dwarfs, for example, will last much longer. So we can look at, the physics of what we know from our sun, looking at it close up. Close up being, 93 million miles or so. We can then apply that to other stars.
So then you've got this main sequence where most stars sort of travel along this path, and then at some point, most of them stay on there, or they leave at some point.
Yeah,
they all basically exit the main sequence. At some point.
Basically, the life cycle of a star is driven by two things: gravity trying to squeeze it, and its own interior trying to produce heat to counteract that. So our sun, for example, our sun was cooler in the past and has been heating up over time, and it will continue to do that. And the reason it's doing that is that gravity is squeezing it down. It's fusing to create heat and pressure that counters the gravity. But as it burns fuel, it becomes somewhat more dense. And so gravity is going to squeeze it a little bit more. It heats up in order to create more pressure to counteract that. And so the main sequence is this kind of gradual brightening and heating. But eventually, the fuel runs out, and it can collapse or explode depending on its size.
Obviously, this is something we don't have to worry about for a while here, but we see lots and lots of examples of it.
Yeah, you can see stars die. You can see stars that have died. So we know that, even though we're still in one little sliver of time. I've been talking with Dr. Matthew Hoffman, an assistant professor of mathematics at the Rochester Institute of Technology. Our program is produced at RIT with the support from the RIT College of Science. I'm your host, Brian Koberlein. Thanks for listening to One Universe at a Time.